Welcome to the speed session. We're going to have 5 papers where each author is going to be presenting for 7 minutes. Afterwards, I'm going to give some thoughts and ask some questions of the presenters. Then they are each going to have about 2 or 3 minutes to respond. And lastly, we're going to open it up for general discussion with a Q&A from the audience. Given the large number of papers, I suggest you write your questions down so that you remember what they are. Otherwise, it might be difficult for everyone. Okay, our first presenter is Anna Stansbury, and she's going to be presenting how socioeconomically diverse is the economics profession. Anna.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for having me. So I'm presenting joint work today with Robert Schultz, who is also here at the conference and is at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And we're both very passionate about gender and racial diversity, and actually met at a diversity and economics conference a few years ago. And that got us interested also in another aspect of diversity that we think is under focused on in these conversations, which is socioeconomic diversity. Next slide, please. So in this talk, I'm just going to outline some descriptive statistics that we've assembled on socioeconomic diversity amongst economics PhDs in the US. We're focusing here on people who received their PhD in economics and in other disciplines since 2010. And we're going to focus only on US-born recipients because it's difficult to compare measures of socioeconomic background across different countries. The data is from the Survey of Earned Doctorates, which is a census of all PhD recipients from US institutions. Everyone who finishes their PhD has to fill out this survey. And the survey contains a variable which tells us what the highest education level of your parent or guardian is. So we split people into 3 buckets. Those who are first-generation college students, that is, they have no parent with a BA or higher. Those who have at least one parent with a BA, but no graduate degree. And those who have at least one parent with a graduate degree, which could be a PhD, it could be a master's or an MBA, or it could be a professional degree like a JD or an MD. And that is our key measure of socioeconomic background for the purposes of this talk. Next slide, please. So the key stylized fact for you to take away, if there's just one you take away from this quick talk, is the one on this slide. On this slide, you can see the 14 major PhD fields as defined by the NSF: engineering, mathematics, computer science, humanities, and so on. We pull out economics from the other social sciences, and we show on the left the share of US-born PhD recipients who were first-generation college graduates in each of these fields, and on the right, the share who have at least one parent with a graduate degree. You can see that economics is by far the lowest in terms of the share of first-generation college graduates. About 14% of economics PhD recipients who were born in the US were first-generation college graduates. In contrast, on the right, you can see that economics is the highest in terms of the share with at least one parent with a graduate degree. About 2/3 of US-born economics PhD recipients have at least one parent who has a PhD, a JD, MD, MBA, and so forth. Economics is less socioeconomically diverse than math, computer science, physical sciences, biological sciences, and far less diverse than the other social sciences. Next slide, please. Another important and striking fact to take away. We know that economics is one of the worst performers in terms of gender diversity and racial and ethnic diversity. We've talked a lot about that today. These charts plot the share who is a first-generation college graduate, so no parent has a BA or higher, on the y-axis against the share who's female on the left, and the share who is an underrepresented racial or ethnic minority, URM, on the right. And you can see that there's this very strong correlation across fields. And what that suggests to us is that the factors that are preventing economics and other similarly non-diverse disciplines from attracting, supporting, and retaining URM individuals and women may be the same kinds of factors that are preventing economics from attracting, retaining, and supporting first-generation college graduates. Next slide, please. It's important to note, however, that the axis of socioeconomic diversity is related to, but not the same as, the axis of racial and ethnic diversity. We know that people who have both of these minoritized characteristics are going to face intersecting challenges. At the same time, we can also see that within every major racial and ethnic group, economics is the least socioeconomically diverse along major fields. So it's not the case that economics' lack of racial and ethnic diversity is what is explaining its lack of socioeconomic diversity. I know the graph is small, but basically what you can see on the left is the share by field that's a first-generation college student within major racial and ethnic groups, and economics is in red, so it's always the smallest share. On the right, it's the share who have at least one parent with a graduate degree. Economics is in red, and you can see that it's always the largest share within every major racial and ethnic group. Next slide, please. One of the factors that may be driving economics to be lacking in socioeconomic diversity is the fact that economics seems to be drawing from institutions, undergraduate institutions, who have a pool of BA students who are less socioeconomically diverse than average. So this shows the undergraduate institution type of US-born economics PhD recipients who did their BA in the US, which is in practice 99% of them. Public institutions tend to have a more socioeconomically diverse population than private institutions. The share with a BA from a public institution is lower in economics than in any other PhD field, slightly less than half. The Ivy Plus institutions, which is a term that Raj Chetty has used in some of his work on college mobility, the 8 Ivy League plus Chicago, Stanford, Duke, and MIT, have a very advantaged student body. More than half of students at the Ivy Plus institutions at the undergraduate level have parents who come from the top 10% of the income distribution. And you can see that economics draws a very large share of its PhD recipients from these Ivy Plus institutions relative to other PhD disciplines. Next slide, please. The final stat I want you to take away is that this lack of socioeconomic diversity is particularly acute in the so-called top-ranked economics PhD programs. So these graphs show the share that's first-generation college student across economics PhD recipients by the rank of the economics program as defined by the US News and World Report ranking of econ graduate programs. So that suggests to you that just over 5% of US-born economics PhD students who are at those top 15 ranked institutions are first-generation college graduates. And about 80%, the graph on the right, have a parent with a graduate degree. The reason we highlight this is because work by Todd Jones and Ariel Sloan has shown that more than half of tenure-track faculty at US economics departments are from these top 15 institutions. So this is indicative of the fact that the professoriate in economics may be even less socioeconomically diverse than the population of PhDs that we're looking at. Next slide, please. So overall, we think that these stats illustrate that economics has a socioeconomic diversity problem. We've been comparing it to the population of PhDs, but we of course all know that PhD recipients are also on average very unrepresentative compared to the general population. So if we compare to the general population of similar age, a US-born economics PhD graduate is 5 times as likely as their similar-aged peers in the US to have a parent with a graduate degree, and 1/5 as likely to be a first-generation college graduate. This matters for equity reasons if we want everyone to have access to our profession. It matters for efficiency reasons if we believe that barriers to access prevent the most talented people from getting into the profession. And it also matters in terms of the substance of our research, particularly as we're a discipline which concerns itself with issues like poverty, inequality, unemployment, access to education that disproportionately affect people from less advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. How can we study these issues without representation from people who actually experience them? So hopefully we've convinced you that socioeconomic background should be an important part of these conversations going forward and spur future research. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Next presenter is Danielle Sandler. She's going to be talking about diversity and labor market outcomes in the economics profession. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'm excited to share this work with my colleagues Lucia Foster and Erica McIntyre. So this work is opinions of us and not the Census Bureau, and all results have been disclosed. So next slide. So we're going to be focusing on the labor market for economics PhDs. And why? Because, as we all know, since we're here at this conference, economics is a diversity and equity problem. In particular, it's harder for women and underrepresented groups to get promoted in academia. But most studies on the economics profession are focused on academia, yet almost half of recent PhD placements were in industry and government jobs. So we both don't know much about those sectors, and we also know little about career mobility in economics. We know a lot about initial placements, but not where people go after those initial placements and how often there's churn between them. Next slide. So this paper sort of plugs some of those gaps in the literature. We link the survey of earned doctorates from the National Center for Education Statistics to longitudinal Census Bureau data on jobs from the longitudinal employer household dynamics data and IRS W-2 data. And this will allow us to look at dispersion of employment and earnings outcomes by demographics. So our data has some key advantages on others that have been used to do this research. We have a large sample. We have 12,500 PhD economists. It's almost universal coverage of U.S. economics PhDs granted in the last 20 years who are then working in the United States. And then we have longitudinal data on the outcomes, so we can track those initial placements as well as the movements across sectors over time. Next slide. So to start with, I want to give a snapshot of where our sample is working in 2017. So we cut this data into two ways, one into broad sectors of academia, industry, and government, and then by demographics. So we can see that the distribution of female economists, this is both citizens and non-citizens, is relatively evenly spread across the three sectors, with a little bit more just representation in government, a little less in academia. Non-U.S. citizens are much more well represented in industry and less represented in government, which makes sense since a lot of industry jobs or government jobs are not available to non-U.S. citizens. For U.S. citizens, we split by 5 broad racial categories. So we combined Hispanic, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. Unfortunately, the sample sizes are too small to show the latter two groups separately. And so this group, you can see sort of the small distribution of this group relative to the U.S. population. We're seeing around 5% in all three sectors, whereas the combined group would be around 19% of the U.S. population. But they are represented in sort of all three sectors. White economists are of over 70% in all three sectors. Asian economists are more represented in industry and government and less represented in academia. Black economists, once again, this is an underrepresented group, so it's about 3%, 3 to 4% in all three sectors, whereas the U.S. population is around 13% African American. But it is evenly distributed across the sectors relatively. And then the last category is 2 or more races and race not reported, which is also relatively evenly spread. The reason we care about these sectors is sort of twofold. The first is that economists working in these sectors have different roles and responsibilities, both in the profession and in the economy. The second is that their compensation in these sectors differs. So I'm going to show that next. So next slide. So this is the earnings distribution the first year after PhD, so this first the placement. And you can see even for initial placements, economists working in industry job earn more than economists in academia and government. One more click on the slides. Yes, and so the gap between government and industry is 85% in this first year, and between academia and industry is 77%. Next slide. This gap in earnings grows over time. So you can see the industry jobs at the median earn a lot more 10 years after PhD. The gap between government and industry is 71%, and academia and industry is 63%. In addition, the industry jobs, there's a much wider distribution. So there's a sort of a range of outcomes for people working in industry, whereas for the academia and government, there is a long right tail. So there's people that are doing significantly better than others, but there's also the big mass around the median. Next slide. So we can't do these earnings distributions by the race groups because we don't have enough sample size. So to understand differences in earnings across race and gender, we're going to run these simple Minster regressions controlling for polynomial inexperience, and then we're going to show the regressions both with and without PhD program fixed effects. So this will help us understand how much sorting into PhD programs plays in the later earnings of the PhDs in our sample. Next slide. So we're starting with female PhDs. So this is relative to men. We can see it between 15% and 9% earnings gap between men and women. And so the gray bar, darker gray bars on the left are without PhD program fixed effects, and the lighter gray bars on the right are with PhD program fixed effects. So you can see that the PhD program fixed effects changes the earnings gap somewhat in some of the sectors, but the gap remains. So it's and then that last column includes both PhD fixed effects and employer fixed effects. So we're throwing a lot in there, and we still see a 9% gap between men and women. Next slide. So for the African American economists relative to white economists, we're seeing without PhD program fixed effects, we are still seeing big earnings gaps, 11% in academia up to 44% in consulting. Some of these are reduced when we add PhD program fixed effects. So the sorting into PhD programs matters here. So that it's both levels of the pipeline are important. And the gap sort of remains even once we include employer fixed effects. So next slide. Next slide. For Hispanic, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, the story is a lot more mixed. So these, in all cases, the percentages are smaller. So the biggest we're seeing is a 6% gap. And there's sort of a mixed story of when we add the PhD program fixed effects. There's a sort of wider distribution of where economists in this group go to school for the PhD program. And then next slide. And finally, Asian Americans, we're seeing another mixed story. We actually see some earnings premiums if we don't control for PhD program fixed effects, but then a gap once we control for PhD program. Once again, these are small, so we're seeing 6 or 7% gap or premium at the largest. Next slide. So I think I'm about out of time, so this is our work in progress. We're really interested in feedback, so please feel free to reach out if you have any comments on things you'd like to see with this interesting data.
Wonderful. Our next paper will be presented by Mackenzie Alston and the effects of the 2020 social justice movement on faculty. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So this is joint work with Sarah Jacobson. Next slide. Over the past decade or so, we've been seeing a lot of high-profile media cases of police brutality. This kind of started with Trayvon Martin in 2012, which started the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. And then every year, we keep hearing more and more stories. Most recently, there was George Floyd, who was killed by a white police officer in Minneapolis in May 25th of 2020. Next slide. And so in this project, we're specifically looking to see how faculty were affected by George Floyd's death and the resulting social justice movement. But before getting into that, evidence and previous research has shown that different faculty have different experiences in academia. And if you look at faculty of color, there are reports of underrepresentation, differences in likelihood of being promoted or tenured, and then also just different experiences at work. So you see a lot of qualitative research where faculty of color are talking about how funding agencies or journals don't acknowledge the type of research that they're interested in the same way as their white colleagues. They sometimes face problems in the classroom where students are questioning their authority. And then they're often asked to do a lot of service work, but aren't rewarded for it when it comes time for promotion and tenure. And then on top of that, they can be in work environments where they might be facing microaggression or other things that makes it difficult for them to work. Next slide. So given all of these factors, we thought it was extremely important to understand how faculty of color are affected when we have these race-related external shocks, like the murder of George Floyd and the social justice movement that followed it. So our two big research questions for this project were, one, how do race-related social justice issues in society affect faculty's research, teaching, and service? And then two, how do these effects vary by race? Next slide. So to answer those questions, we conducted a survey where we reached out to our faculty at over 120 institutions in the United States. And we particularly looked at faculty in economics, political science, psychology, and sociology, and related fields or departments like business and policy schools. And what we were doing was asking them how they thought their research, teaching, and service were affected by the social justice movement, not only during the summer in which George Floyd was murdered, but also the academic year that followed. In the end, we collected almost 1,300 responses. They were predominantly from white, non-Hispanic scholars, almost an even split between women and men, and they predominantly came from research institutions. Next slide. So we asked about, again, research and teaching, but for this presentation, I'll focus on some of the research results. One question that we asked them was how many projects do you think were negatively affected, not affected at all, or positively affected over the summer because of the social justice movement? This is showing you the difference in responses based off of race, where the darker bar is showing you the number of projects they said were negatively affected, lighter bar is showing you no effect, and the medium bar is showing you a positive effect. On average, white scholars and Black scholars are working on a similar number of projects, but when you look at the fraction of projects that were negatively affected, that number is higher for Black scholars. And that's true even when you add controls for things like age and tenure status. However, there is no difference in the fraction of projects that people said were positively affected by the social justice movement. Next slide. We also asked some questions like how their ability to mentally concentrate on research were affected. And so this is showing you the distribution of responses. Darker bar is showing you Black respondents and responses, and lighter bars are showing you white responses. And you see that for Black scholars, over 60% of them were saying their ability to mentally concentrate was negatively affected. And in fact, when you kind of pull these very negatively affected and somewhat negatively affected responses together, you see that there's a higher fraction of Black scholars in that group compared to white scholars, and that's even when you add for controls. But interestingly, there's also a higher fraction of Black scholars that say that their concentration on research was positively affected by the social justice movement compared to white scholars. Next slide. We were also interested to see how these effects carried on into the academic year. So this is still looking at the ability to mentally concentrate, but it's focused on academic year 2020 to 2021. So you see that the responses are different, but we're still seeing a significant difference in the number of Black scholars that said that there was a negative effect on their concentration on research compared to white scholars. But the difference in positive effects, the racial difference, is no longer statistically significant once we look at the academic year. Next slide. To try to understand what was going on a little bit better, we also looked at how people were dividing their time between research, teaching, and service, and how this was affected by the social justice movement. What we saw is that the predominant answer among both white and Black scholars was that their research time fell because of the social justice movement, and their teaching time increased as well as their service. But when you dig into the service component, you start to learn some interesting things. So 92% of Black scholars and 98% of white scholars said that the time that they spent on diversity, equity, and inclusion increased since May 2020. But when you actually look at the hours of time spent on these types of service activities, you see that Black scholars were spending more time on this work. On top of that, they were more likely to have a DEI leadership role, and they were more likely to say that their time spent mentoring students of color increased after George Floyd died in May. Next slide. To sort of wrap up, we did find evidence that faculty were negatively affected by the social justice movement when it concerned their research, and then wasn't able to show you, but also in terms of their teaching. And this was definitely true in the summer of 2020, but we also saw some effects going on into the following academic year, where there were still, in some cases, evidence of racial differences. And so we believe part of this can be explained by how people's time use changed, where the big story is that more hours were spent on diversity, equity, and inclusion for Black faculty compared to white faculty. But it's all not a sad story. We did ask people if they felt happy about the service that they were doing, for example, and the most common answer was yes. And as I showed in these slides, some people were saying that their research was positively affected by the movement too. Next slide. So that wraps it up here, but I put the email of myself and Sarah in case you want to reach out later with questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is going to be Leonora Rees, Lifting Diversity and Inclusion in Economics, how the Australian Women in Economics Network put evidence into action. Take it away.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this conference. It's a pleasure to be representing the Women in Economics Network from Australia and to present this paper, which is co-authored with Rebecca Cassells, Jugyu Yengen and Danielle Wood. Now, for all of those researchers out there who have been investigating and interrogating what works to improve gender equality in economics, we want you to know that we have been reading and learning from your research, and this paper is a documentation of the practical way that we listen to your research and put it into action. Next slide, please. Now, in Australia, oh, have we missed a slide there? Yes, thank you. In Australia, we acknowledge our First Nations people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather. I'm joining you from the lands of the Yugamba people, which is in southeast Queensland. Their traditional greeting in Bungalang language is Jingi Wala. The image you see there on the screen is the east coast of Australia looking out to the Pacific Ocean, obviously with the US and Canada on the other side. So even though we have many kilometres of ocean between us, we are united in our common cause. Next slide, please. So what happens when we run a Google search for Australian economist? On the next slide, you can see it's an impressive and a distinguished collage, but we need to squint hard to spot the females or anyone who is not white. And some of the women, like Wendy Carlin in the bottom corner, don't even get their own photo. Now, this picture is important because, as has been highlighted throughout this conference, women's underrepresentation is not just about headcounts, it's also about voice, it's about influence, it's about respect and recognition of women's contributions. On the next slide, please. To provide some benchmarks using our census data, we see that women comprise around 1/3 of economists in Australia, and that fraction has not budged over recent decades. They comprise around 40% of the population who hold an economics qualification. On the next slide, please, you'll see that inside school classrooms, female representation is falling. These top two graphs are for two of Australia's largest states. What's disillusioning is that we actually used to be at around equal shares during the early 1990s. On the bottom graph there, we see that in university lecture theatres, female students remain in the minority. On the next slide, please. We see that in terms of the gender imbalance in academia, female professors are also in stark minority. So that's the picture. What did Australia do about this? Moving to our next slide, please. Professor Deborah Cobb-Clark of the University of Sydney raised this issue with the Economic Society of Australia. and convened a mentoring retreat in 2016. And that's where the idea for WHEN was born, and it was launched in 2017. And we articulated these 4 objectives with a holistic outlook. The first, to support women currently in the profession. And this is not just about career development. This is about providing a sense of community, of solidarity, of belonging to the profession. The second point is about fostering women's ongoing career progression to achieve that senior representation and leadership. The third point is about public visibility, recognition, opportunities for influence, including in public policy discussion. And the fourth point, thinking ahead to the next generation and fueling that pipeline of future female economists. Now, on the next slide, please, you'll see that this has given rise to an array of initiatives, and you can read more about these in the paper, but just to highlight a few here. Mentoring. We paid attention to what other organisations, such as CSWEP in the US, had been doing, and one of our mentoring programs was conducted as an RCT with favourable results. We were mindful about gender equality approaches that imply that women have some sort of capability, deficit or deficiency that needs fixing. We know it's not the women, but the system and the culture that needs fixing. And so we have also invested in ways to elevate awareness and research about implicit biases and what needs to change at an organisational and societal level. And one way is through our annual Australian Gender Economics Workshop. We have created a media register, so journalists and conference organisers no longer have an excuse to say, I just can't find a female economist to talk to. And our resources for students highlight the wide-ranging opportunities that economics offers, and it's communicated with authenticity and passion. And you can find these freely available on the WHEN website, including our video on YouTube, which is titled Economics, Understand the World Around You. On the next slide, please. Some key themes from the literature and the research really guided our approach. So our paper offers more detail, but here's a snapshot. To tackle misperceptions about economics, we focused on the human dimension and well-being. And you'll see that the STEM fields have done this quite well in their efforts to attract more females. We highlighted the practical usefulness of economics as a life skill, and the research on andragogical teaching, which is teaching for adults as opposed to teaching for children, really highlights the importance of examples that students can personally relate to. We knew we needed to tackle narrow stereotypes of economists through greater diversity in role models and public visibility. This was important not just to inspire more women, but so that more men, including that next generation of male students coming through the system, become accustomed to seeing female economists as the norm. Now, the research shows us that females want to fix problems and help others. They are community-minded problem solvers. I mean, what more could you ask for? So we highlighted to students how an economics toolkit equips you for this. And we took note of studies that found that talking about salaries and earnings actually deterred female students. And you'll see that in all of our WHEN student resources, we do not mention how much you can earn. More broadly, we were informed by the research on what works to address gender biases in workplaces, including the influence of unconscious bias. And WHEN has also been a vehicle for highlighting where women's experiences are being neglected or deprioritised in economic policy making. And WHEN has advocated for this to be addressed, such as through gender lensing or gender responsive budgeting. Next slide, please. Now, once WHEN was created, what happened? Well, we saw female membership in the ESA double and stay that way. And this is in absolute numbers as well as a proportion. On the next slide, please. we do need to invest more in our metrics and our evaluation. That's an important part of our next stage of development. But an area of clear improvement has been the increase in women economists featured in the Australian media. And this coincided with our public broadcaster, the ABC, launching a 50-50 target. So WEN was able to assist through our media register, through referrals, through supporting our members to participate. There's a few quotes there that reflect on this impact, but that quote at the bottom really speaks to it. A student told us that she had recently started taking an interest in economics on the news, and she just assumed that most economists were female because that's what she saw. So that's the type of impact that we want to have. The next slide, please. Now, in the paper, we report on the results of a survey that we conducted to get a sense of WEN's impact. The sample size is small, but these indicative results are positive, especially in terms of WEN improving the representation and recognition of women, broadening the range of topics being discussed, and raising awareness about equality and diversity issues. We also collected qualitative feedback. On the next slide, please. This revealed an awareness amongst members that WEN was important not just for women, but for shifting perceptions among men. And you can see that in that quote in the last paragraph. It says it's just as important for young men to look up and see both genders represented, and for them to broaden their thinking around economics and to think about women's issues as actually being human issues.
Lenora, you're slightly over time, so I'm just going to ask you to wrap up. Yeah.
Sure. So on our next slide there, we've got final slide. Where in the paper, we share some practical challenges, including limited resources, aims to conduct more robust evaluations, improve diversity within WEN, and sustain momentum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, our last presentation today will be by Renee Adams, and she's going to be presenting the 3 S's. Actually, I made that up. It's sex, science, and society. Take it away.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Okay, I had a problem. Yeah, okay, good. So last but hopefully not least, so the story of this paper, oh, actually, let me say this paper is co-authored with Jing Su, who should be also online. So the story of this paper is that the business school that I'm in circulated an email listing the people or the faculty members who had been listed as among the top scientists, among the top 100,000 scientists worldwide, according to the data that we're going to use in this paper. And obviously, you know, the bad news was, of course, that most of the top scientists were men in the business school. And so that was bad news. The good news was that I saw this data and I was like, oh, this is potentially quite useful for looking at women's representation in science. And the reason that it's potentially useful is because it has an international dimension. Okay, and what we're actually interested in here is the standard story that women's preferences somehow explain everything. Okay, so we don't think that that's necessarily true. And so how does the international data help us? Well, unless you believe that women and men are systematically sort of biologically different across countries, we argue that we should observe the same sort of occupational distribution across sciences in each country if preferences drive women's selection into science. If we don't find that men and women distribution in science looks basically the same in each country, then that suggests there's other factors that matter. So it's a very simple story. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're basically arguing that it's not just preferences, it's also culture. And here we're looking at societal culture. So the data that we have comes from this study that was underlying the announcement at the business school about all our top scientists, which consists of all the people who were cited. So basically, it's this paper by Ioannidis et al. From 2019. They took all the people who were cited in 2019 and ranked them by the citations. So it's essentially the top 100,000 among the people cited in 2019. The data covers 20 scientific fields from 137 countries. And we're doing something very simple here. I won't show you all the results, but basically the first observation is, there's variation across countries in the representation of women among the top scientists. There's variation across fields. And what we want to look at is whether culture matters. And so what we're looking at in particular are two measures of culture. The first is country level sort of gender culture. So these are country level culture measures specifically related to women's participation in the labor force. We get these from the World Economic Forum, from the World Value Survey. We have female labor force participation, and there's this new database on women in business laws. We also have a measure of field level culture, which comes from a paper by Leslie et al. From 2015. And what they do is they ask academics, what is the level of brilliance necessary to be in your field? And so we're going to use these measures of brilliance to see whether they matter. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we do is very simple. So we have data at the individual level. We collapse it to the field country level. And we calculate the percent of women among the top scientists. So that's the dependent variable. And we regress this dependent variable on measures of country level culture that are specific to gender. And the columns here vary primarily by the measure of culture that we use. The 4 columns on the left, we have the different measures of culture, 4 different measures of culture, and the main variable here is really just the culture measure. And what you see is gender culture is related to women's representation among the top scientists in a country. In the middle 2 columns, what we do is we get data from another paper on the percent of women among scientists in a field. So this is not just among top scientists, but it's among scientists in a field. We use that as the main explanatory variable. And the idea there is obviously if you have more women in a field, you should observe more female top scientists, right? And so you do observe this positive association. And then in the columns on the right, what we do is we look at whether culture sort of moderates the conversion from the field to the top, right? And so we interact culture with the percent of women in the field, and we do observe a positive correlation. So this suggests that when culture is more favorable towards women, then women are much more likely to be able to make it to the top. And I haven't discussed fixed effects or whatever here, but we do try to put in field and country fixed effects in order to account for sort of other emitted variables. Now, what I'm not showing you here in the interest of time is some individual level regressions that we have looking at women's ranking and movement across countries. But I will show you something about STEM in the next slide, please. So the argument about women's preferences is particularly prominent when people discuss STEM fields. And so what we do here is we focus on looking at women in STEM fields and whether culture affects women's entry into STEM. And what you see here is the interaction with STEM and culture is actually negative. And at first we thought, well, how is this possible, right? And then we graphed the result, and basically what we find is gender culture leads to greater women's representation in STEM fields and non-STEM fields, but actually the conversion is higher for the non-STEM fields. And so, which is an interesting finding that we weren't expecting, and we think deserves some more attention, because there is a backlash right now also about sort of the non-STEM fields claiming that they're not getting enough attention. Next slide, please. Okay, and just finally, the previous results highlight that country culture matters. These results sort of point out that they also matter. So what we hear is we put in these beliefs about how brilliant you have to be in the field. And the column on the left, you see that the more brilliant that people think you have to be in a field, the fewer women are top scientists in that field. Two columns, we look at the male and female beliefs separately. Both of these are negatively correlated with women's representation, although the men's beliefs are more strongly correlated. And when we put both of them together, we see that only the men's beliefs survive. So this idea that women's preferences only matter doesn't seem to hold water. It also seems to be that men's preferences play a role here. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so to conclude, we think that evidence is consistent with the idea that it's not just women's preferences, culture also matters, and we think that we need to take a broader perspective on why women do not enter science. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm going to moderate myself now, I think, and discuss these 5 papers. I won't be doing it necessarily in order, so don't feel bad if I jump around. It'll have to do with what I thought made more sense. I can't see my slides, so are they up? No.
Just 1 second, sorry. Just 1 moment and we'll have them up.
Okay, thank you. Okay, wonderful. So I guess first thing I want to say is thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to discuss these 5 papers. It was a challenging job and I really enjoyed it, I have to say. So what I'm going to try to do now in my discussion is to be able to fill out what they had to leave a bit because of limited time, maybe make some general points and also ask some general questions. The questions are not always going to be paper specific, so if you feel like tackling them in your answering time or response time, please go ahead and do so. Next slide. Okay, so I think at the end of today, we've learned what we kind of knew, which is that economics is an amazingly elitist profession. It lacks diversity in gender, racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic dimensions. The big questions, of course, are why and what we can do to change this. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. So I'm going to start with the socioeconomic background of US PhD economists. And this paper by Schultz and Stansberry examines the socioeconomic origins of PhD economists using the SED and restricting the sample to US-born PhD recipients. Next slide. I'm going to show you some of what she found. I'm going to be stressing more the temporal dimension than what she did. So this is a figure from her paper, and what you can see there in the red line at the top is that the share of economists with at least one parent with a post-grad degree, meaning PhD, master's, law degrees, etc., from 1970 onwards has been increasing, has every other discipline put up here. But it's been increasing more for economics than for any of the other disciplines. The counterpart of that we can see also in the next slide, which shows you that the share of what Anna called first generation economists, which is economists with no parent with a BA or higher, that's been decreasing for all disciplines as well, but it's decreased most for economics. Okay, economics started a little bit below most of them, but it's now way below most of them. Neither of these two facts in some sense are surprising. The share of PhDs in some sense has been increasing in the economy. The share of US-born economists, the share of US individuals with no parents of a BA has also been decreasing. And one thing I would suggest, just so that we can sort of feel how elitist PhDs are in general, would be to graph that figure, include one more line in your diagrams so that we can see what's happening to people of this age group as we go a long time, and see how much more elitist PhDs in general have become. Next slide. This is a share of female in economics is in red. This is a fact that is now well known, a lot due to work by CSWEP and a lot of authors that I'm not going to mention now. And as you can see, economics has a low share of women, and like math, the dark green line, and computer science, the lighter green line, it's kind of gotten stuck over time. Not only has it gotten stuck since the beginning of the 90s, more or less, but it's actually slightly decreased, which is kind of bad news. And it's actually decreased in mathematics as well, and I'll get back to that. Next slide, please. The share of underrepresented minorities, those are increasing in the population as a whole. So one more time, I would say it'd be really interesting to see what's happening just in general in the US in order to be able to judge this figure from a more socioeconomic point of view, more generally for all PhDs. But as you can see, there's very different behavior by the red line. Once again, that's economics, and by other disciplines such as psychology or social science, excluding economics. Those are the top rapidly rising lines that you see in that figure. Economics, once again, has gotten stuck, towards the end of the 90s. There's not been really much of an increase in the share of URMs among US-born PhD graduates in that discipline. The same thing is true, again, I'll point out, in math and in computer science. Actually, let me take that back. It's true in math and less true in computer science in the last few years. Next slide, please. This is a slide that Anna showed you, and I'm just showing it to you again. It's really amazing. It tells you that this lack of socioeconomic diversity is not coming because URMs are way underrepresented in economics. It's just true in general for each group that you look at. And I know that it's small, but it's Asian non-Hispanics, Black non-Hispanics, Hispanics of all races, other non-Hispanics, and white non-Hispanics. And in fact, that slope, let's talk about it as a slope between, economics at the top on the left, at the bottom on the right, one of them being graduate degrees, the other one being first generation. That slope is actually steeper for some of the underrepresented minorities than it is for whites, showing you that it's really not coming from the underrepresentation, but it's just a general fact that's true for all groups. And here I'm not showing you gender, but it's actually true for women as well. It's not that they come from a different socioeconomic background than their male counterparts by and large. Next slide. This slide Anna also showed, and this shows you that economics is also elitist in the sense that the share that has a BA from the Ivy Plus institutions is largest in economics. It's 16%. What she didn't show you is actually on the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. Which is the share of Ivy Plus bachelors, BAs, by the rank of the PhD program. And it's really quite astounding. I did not know this fact. If you are ranked 1 to 6 as a US PhD program, your share of Ivy Leagues is going to be, 40-something percent, which is, just gigantic. And whereas if 7 to 15, it just falls to below, I can't really guess it, let's say 28%, and 16 plus, it's below 10%. So you really see a very steep gradient in the share of the PhD class that's coming from Ivy Leagues. The counterpart of this, not fully, because there are some elite public institutions, is the fact that those from rank 1 to 6 have a smaller share of their their PhD students coming from undergraduates that come from public institutions. Next slide. So the questions I would have for this is, well, obvious. Why is economics less diverse than other disciplines? So what the authors do is they ran a series of regressions with a dependent variable that was having a post-grad parent. And this was run on the field, so economics, physical sciences, biological science, etc., and a series of controls. The controls included, they were increasing as we went along in that table, the year, the demographics, the BA field, the BA institution, and the PhD institution. Now, as they added the controls, this decreased the indicator on economics PhD from 15 percentage points to 5 percentage points. And the similar exercise done not for a parent post-grad, but rather for having parents that are first generation, also decreased the economics PhD indicator from around, say, 12 or 13 percentage points to about 5 percentage points. So it really decreased it. Next slide. Now, what this exercise does, though, is that it really reassigns our ignorance to an earlier stage. So, for example, an important contributor to the socioeconomic privilege status of economics PhD is the fact that their most important feeders into economics are math and economics BAs. Now, math and economic BAs have themselves more socioeconomically privileged students. So we're now kind of taking everything back one step, which is a useful thing nonetheless to do, but it's kind of just moves the mystery back, and we have to ask ourselves, why is it that math and economic BAs come from more privileged socioeconomic backgrounds? Similarly with the Ivy Plus institutions, we can control for BAs, where people are getting their BAs before they do their PhDs. That's going to, that's going to have some explanatory power for the degree of parents with postgrad degrees. But again, why is it that Ivy Plus institutions have such a large presence in PhD economics, especially in the top-ranked graduate programs? So I think we're just taking the question back one step. And next slide. And one potentially important question or factor, and I couldn't understand how important it might be, is that economic PhDs are overwhelmingly not born in the US. So 70% maybe was a kind of my back of the envelope calculation, looking at your data, was not born in the US. And you have to ask yourself how this might be affecting the type of US born student who actually makes it into an economics PhD program. So one thing I would suggest to the authors is that maybe they want to get some balance on this by saying, well, let's suppose that it was like the next science or social science. It had that level of foreign students. And suppose that only the most privileged are going to come in first and then go down the road. How would that then affect the degree of socioeconomic privilege that you see in economics? Okay. Next slide, please. So let me turn now to the paper that Danielle presented. And if Anna's papers can be seen as asking, where do economics PhD come from? The paper by Danielle asks instead, where do they go and how do they fare? And it has great data in that sense that it combines the same SED that Anna was using with census and IRS data, which allows a longitudinal perspective on outcomes. Now, we have a similar issue that I was pointing out with respect to foreigners that we saw in Anna's paper. Here, the authors can only study the sample that's working in the US. So I think that, my guess is that, Anna's sample went down to about 10,000. Here, the sample size decreases from 23,500 to 12,500. So we're looking at 53% of the class of PhDs, but that's the ones that we're studying, and that's not necessarily a wrong thing to do. It just is something to keep in mind when you're trying to interpret the data. Next slide. So what are the main findings? So everything is relative. So I'm just going to stress that because it looks like distributions of numbers. It's actually not a distribution, it's all relative. So relative to the distribution of male economists, women are more likely to be in government and less likely to be in academia. Relative to the distribution of white economists, Asian economists are more likely to be in industry and less likely to be in academia. Relative to the distribution of white economists, Black economists are more likely to be in government and less likely to be in industry. And relative to the distribution of white economists, Hispanics, AIAN, and NHPI economists are more likely to be in academia. So that's in terms of employment sectors. Next slide, please. Oh, I thought I would be able to see this better. Okay, so I think Danielle put up quite a bit of this. I'm just going to stress a bit because I found it quite fascinating. So I need to make this bigger. Hold on one second. I need to squeeze you guys. So it's the black line there that is academics that come from the top 5%. The blue line is the top 20%, and the others are the little more line on the left, that's the dotted one. And what this is showing you is earnings in first year by PhD rank. On the left is academia, on the right is industry. Yes, there's inequality. You know, people in the top 20 relative to the top 5 are earning 87% of those in the top 5. Those in the other are earning 64%. And as you can see, that gap is less important in industry. After that first year, it's 93% and 74%. Next slide. The interesting thing is what happens later and the contrast between academia and industry, and some speculation as to what that might tell us. So as you can see on the left, again, everything has moved further apart. Now the top 20 are making 73%, whereas others, the other group is making 52% of what the top 5 are making. That's after 10 years. Whereas in industry, actually, things have gotten closer together. The earnings have converged. You see they're at 95% for the top 20 relative to the top 5, and at 75% for the others relative to the top 5. Now, if you wanted to take a very simplistic view, but not necessarily incorrect, you might want to argue, you know what, this is showing me that there's some weird thing that goes on in academia, whereby initial merit or small differences in merit get really, really magnified over time. Not necessarily due to anything that's meritocratic, but the fact that if you're in a top 5 department, you're going to be asked to present at many more conferences. You're going to be, you know, sending your papers to the top journals. You're going to be doing a lot of things that if you're even in the top, you know, 15th department, you're not going to be asked to do. Maybe industry is more competitive. Maybe that's what we're seeing there. That's what is happening after 10 years. Of course, the simple rejoinder to that is that no, it's not that. It's just that, you know, those initial differences, they really, really matter. And you see the true merit after 10 years, whereas the selection that happens in industry is far less, you know, it brings everybody much closer together. So it's not clear what it's showing, but it is I find it a very interesting fact that I wanted to bring more attention to. Next slide. What about women? This Danielle didn't have time to go into. Initially on the left, this is after the first year after PhD. This is now all top 20 economics programs. So we're not looking at differences in rank. We're just looking at differences in gender or differences in earnings by gender, subject to being in the top 20 ranked PhD programs. And you see there is a bit of a difference, but it's not much, not for the median, not for the 75th percentile. 10 years later, you see that the means and the medians and the 75th percentiles by gender have moved much further apart. So again, we see something going on. It'd be interesting to know what it is. Next slide. So when I saw these first 2 papers, I really maybe I was in a bad mood about how elitist economics was. And it made me try to think about what might be going on. There's a very nice article in the Journal of Economics Perspectives called The Superiority of Economists, where superiorities should not be taken literally. It's by Fourcade, Ollion, and Algan. And it discusses the insular and hierarchical structure of our discipline. For hiring, there's much more exchange among top departments than in other fields. And in fact, one of the presenters early this morning was discussing the case of Mary Daly, who's governor of the San Francisco Fed, and saying, you know, how it was risky to hire her because she didn't come from an elite PhD program. And if somebody does badly and they're not from an elite PhD program, it reflects badly on you from having hired her. Whereas if you hire a safe bet from a top PhD program, maybe, it just, it happens. So in any case, hiring is much more compared to other disciplines, much more among top departments than in other fields. And publishing, which is a theme that's very dear to us in economics, academic profession, the top 5 departments account for 29% of all the authors in the JPE and 38% in the QJE. For networks, and this is my term, not theirs, it's immense in economics. It's really important, I would say, if you're a young economist, to partner, to write something with somebody who is in a top 5 department. The top 5 departments, if you are PhD, comes from a top 5 department. The JPE publishes 46% of its articles from someone who came from a top 5 department, whereas the QJE publishes 58%. Furthermore, there's control of institutions. This is something that we really need to think a bit more about, I think, in economics. The editors, the co-editors of leading journals, the NBER program directors, the AEA positions, you name it. I haven't seen any numerical study about it, but visually, belonging to a top 5 department is very important. Next slide, please. So now let me turn to the top scientists paper. Now I'm going a bit out of sequence. So the paper that Renee presented explores the relationships among the share of women top scientists and the share of women in science and several measures of culture. And what they show is that countries with greater gender equality in terms of its culture, which is measured in varieties of ways, have a larger female share of top scientists controlling for the field in which they're in. And within a given country, a greater female share of scientists in that field is associated with a larger share of female top scientists in that field. And furthermore, the effect of the female share of scientists is larger in countries with more equal gender culture. That is, it seems to have a magnifying effect in terms of getting it there. And that was the main interesting result that I found from that paper. Can we move one slide? Sorry. So what I put up here are PISA scores. This comes from a paper from Guizo, Montesapienza, Zingales. On the top, you see the gender gap in math in yellow, in gray for reading. The gap is women's scores minus male scores, the average, okay, by country. And so you will be able to figure out what countries it is. And on the bottom, you have actually the gender gap index, which is a measure of gender inequality. It's actually the WEF one that the authors also use. And what you can see is that there is some relation to be shown more rigorously than this, but there's some relationship between measures of women's equality in other spheres and the gender gap in math. And as you go towards the right, the gender gap in math slowly is disappearing and in fact gets overturned for the case of Iceland, whereas the gender gap in reading remains and if anything could even become larger. So this paper that came out in 2008 in Science was just meant to show that there's a relationship between culture as measured by gender gaps and culture is measured by gender gaps via this index and the gender gap that you see. Raising the question once again, as Renee properly did, how much of this is preferences and how much is it something else? Next slide. So I guess my question to the authors would be, does the same relationship exist if you use a gender gap in math PISA scores to measure culture? Well, I think it'd be very convincing since it speaks to something that most scientists need, which is mathematics. And in particular, since often there's a discussion about distributions, if you were to take the gender gap, say, in being in the top 10% of a country level distribution of PISA scores. By the way, I forgot to say, for those of you who are not familiar with what a PISA score is, PISA scores are reading and math scores, math tests taken for a representative sample of 15-year-olds from 40 plus countries, more or less. So would this be, if you were to take the top 10% of the country level distribution of PISA scores, would this be a better predictor of the share of female, of top scientists? And then your measure of top scientists had to do with citations. And as various panels that came before us have pointed out, those might be quite gender biased themselves. And so if they are gender biased, maybe what you're directly picking up is that bias and not necessarily in some other sense what's the share of top female scientists. So it would be interesting to see if you could find some other metric, maybe patents, maybe something else that would be worth looking at. Next slide. So the paper that Mackenzie presented was based on a survey that she and her co-authors did in December of 2020 and January of 2021. And the main question that they asked is, how did the social justice movement affect faculty research, teaching, and service in the summer of 2020 and in the fall semester of that year? Their main findings were that Black scholars were more likely to report a negative effect on research concentration, on research and on concentration, and also a somewhat larger positive effect during the summer. Black scholars were more likely to report a negative effect on research in the fall, showing that these effects were persistent. Women and younger scholars were also negatively affected, and the time spent on diversity, equity, and inclusion services increased for all, but significantly more for Black scholars. Next slide. I guess one question I had was, did the time that women spent on DEI services also increase significantly more than their male counterparts? It's something I was interested in knowing from your paper. And of course, a big question is, how should we address the fact that some events have disproportionate effects on some groups? Next slide. Now, we ask, as you well know, especially in the last 10 years, for much more service work from URMs and from women, especially because they are underrepresented. Almost no place that I've ever been at or seen compensates for this, which is really a very unfair form of taxation, precisely because these are also not things that are necessarily going to get you tenure. So especially for younger kids, but really for everyone. I think that the fact that this is not taken explicitly into account is disproportionately benefiting some groups and disproportionately hurting others. And it's a system that really needs to be questioned. So moving to something like a point system for teaching and service work would really allow for easier and more transparent compensation. So you do more hours of service, maybe you should be doing less teaching, or you should be paid more. But there should be something that's done that explicitly recognizes the incredible burden that we put on certain groups in academia. Next slide. Moving on to the paper on women in economics in Australia by Leonora. The main findings there was that there was a shrinking share of women who enroll in economics in year 12, which is their last year of high school. There was a fairly constant share of women who enrolled for bachelor's degree in economics. And that when, which was established in 2017 and is undertaking many initiatives, seems to have made a difference. And we saw that clearly with the very large rise of people who joined I think it's called the ESA in Australia as a result of next slide, sorry. So what I did here is I just went to an Australian website just to see how different Australia looked, perhaps from the US. And what I would like you to concentrate on here is, this is showing you in, I'll call it rusty red color, the women, and an orangey color, the men. And what I wanted you to show you was what was happening in IT, because I want to make a comment about it. IT is in the middle row. It's the second from the left. And as you can see over time, the share of women in IT actually fell. Okay. Something that also happened in the US. Next slide. And I don't understand why it is that Australians call it commerce. But if, by the way, this combines commencing BAs and PhDs. So I'm not separating it out because it wasn't separated out there. This looks now more closely, as you can see, the share of women in math kind of stayed constant, the share of women in math was constant for a while, and then it kind of fell in the last few years. Similarly, it's falling a bit in physics. If you go over to the right and you look at women in economics, you also see that relative to the mid-2000s, there's been a slight fall of the share of women in economics. Next slide. Next slide, please. So I felt that Australia looked remarkably similar to the US. It shows a slightly shrinking share of women in economics, math, and IT, which is very similar to what we see in the United States. For myself, I would have loved to have seen the evolution over time of other fields relative to economics for easier comparison and also differentiating across academic levels, distinguishing between secondary school versus BAs versus PhDs. One has had a clear impact on the female share of keynote speakers and membership in the ESA. And the interventions that they've done makes use of the, is it Royal? I hope it's Royal. The Royal Bank of Australia's findings, it might not be Royal, the Royal Bank of Australia's findings that female students' interest in economics, and this has been repeated before in other sessions, relative to their male counterparts, is more strongly motivated by wanting to identify and solve problems and by interest in social issues such as climate change and globalization. Next and last slide. Yeah. So some final thoughts about what we might be able to do or want to do. First of all, it seems obvious that teaching economics so that it focuses more on socially relevant questions may result in economics being more attractive to women and URM. For very similar reasons, I would say, it's also then more likely to appeal to students from less privileged socioeconomic backgrounds. These might also be students who are more interested in solving socially relevant questions. And of course, it's not that economics is not interested in socially relevant questions. It's just that first-year economics does not focus on any of them, for the most part. Now, a problem in economics is it's truly elitist nature. People think, partly because of ideology, partly maybe self-interest, partly some sort of bias, that what they attain is really their merit, okay? Yes, maybe what white men get, reflects, something else, maybe there's discrimination, but if they get it, it's their merit. So, that's true for salaries, for publications, for prizes, for keynotes. I'm now speaking very much of academia where one really sees this. We now question this when it comes to white men. And maybe it's really time to think about the political economy of our profession and question the outsized influence of the top 5 PhD programs. Work that has studied the role of networking economics, works that would study the role of networks in economics, from editorial boards to assigning referees, to choosing speakers, to running the key prize granting committees of the AEA, would be very, very helpful in this respect. And I'm really looking forward to someone doing the same type of work that we've seen today from all 5 of you in very different ways, to doing it for questioning why we accept that the top 5 departments in our profession get to run things. Okay, thank you very much. With that, I think I'm in time, hopefully. I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to let you answer whatever questions moved you to you wanted to answer, and why don't we do it in the same order of presentation? So why don't we start with you, Anna?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that discussion, Raquel. I found myself nodding along to a lot of it, not just the parts that were about my presentation. So thank you. I'll address two things briefly. I mean, there's lots one could say, but just in the interest of time. The first point is about elitism and the broader question of Ivy Plus schools and BA institution. I completely agree that this seems to point up a broader question of why are economics PhDs selecting from these institutions or from a smaller subset of institutions? And why does that look different than in other fields? Is that a broader phenomenon of elitism? One of the things that we will be wanting to do is to dig deeper into other categories of BA institutions to look at this. So we just did this rough categorization of the Ivy Plus and looking at public versus private. We also want to look at the top public feeder schools into economics PhDs. We have very granular data thanks to the mobility study on undergraduate institutions in the US of the socioeconomic background by institution that we can hopefully match to try to understand these different feeding patterns depending on more granular BA institution. And that's definitely a priority. On the other point about international students, I think this is the big thing that we also want to dig into more. You're absolutely right. So 70% of economics PhDs granted in the US are to non-US born individuals. And this is the highest share of any PhD discipline. So this is one of the kind of unique factors about economics in the US. I'm one of those people. I wasn't born in the US. So trying to understand socioeconomic background for these groups and how that differs, and then also whether the internationalization of the economics PhD is sort of disproportionately edging out less advantaged US-born candidates is one of our priorities. 2 facts just to share with the audience quickly that I didn't share in the talk. One is when we do those buckets by parental education for all PhD recipients, wherever they were born, you still see that economics is pretty close to the bottom. Humanities starts to edge it out in terms of the lowest share of first-generation college recipients, but economics is still below math and computer science and still well below the other social sciences, even when you include all PhD recipients. Obviously, parental education means different things in different countries, especially when you look at the degree to which a parent having a postgraduate degree implies greater socioeconomic status than having a BA. So this is going to be a bit rougher, but when we look across continent of birth and look at PhD recipients across fields in economics versus other fields who were born in Europe, who were born in the Americas, outside of the US, who were born in Africa, who were born in Asia, who were born in Australasia, you also see that pattern re-emerging, that economics is less socioeconomically diverse on average, particularly for those born in Europe and in the Americas. Not nearly the same extent for those born in Asia or Africa, which is quite interesting and something we want to dig into more to see in which context are those patterns of advantage reproducing themselves. So I'll stop there and let the next person say something.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Danielle.
Yes, so thank you. Yeah, we have a lot of additional results that we've been working on. We really wanted to focus on the outcomes by race for this conference, but we have been looking. Unfortunately, the diversity issue in economics is so severe that we can't do a lot of the exercises we're interested in by race. So those earnings distributions. We've done it by some other cuts. There's enough gender distribution, enough observations by gender. And then we do the different institutions. And so that kind of builds on the hierarchy in economics. So we see that, I think you showed that we see in academia, the top 5 and top 20 matter a lot. Like the outcomes for those graduates are significantly different than those from the lower ranked school using RepEc ranks. Whereas if the economists that go into government and industry, we don't see that sort of ranking of outcomes nearly so strongly. So it's for thinking about the economics profession more broadly than just academia, maybe one way of sort of thinking about getting away from the elitism of the top 5 schools.
Thank you, Danielle. Mackenzie.
Thank you. You gave a wonderful discussion of our paper. One of the points that you made was about whether or not there were gender differences in DEI service. And Sarah and I haven't gotten a chance to look at that yet, but I wrote that down on something to do at the top of our to-do list. And I think, I've spent a lot of time, Sarah and I both have, trying to figure out, like, okay, now that we have these results, what do we do next? And I think your point about making sure that people are compensated for the work that they're doing is like the key highlights. So if you're asking people to do all this extra service work, but then that's not going to be rewarded in their promotion and tenure packets, that's a huge problem. And so we're hoping that by bringing awareness of the results from our findings, from our survey, we can get departments that kind of think differently about how they want to count the work that faculty do.
Wonderful, thank you. Leonora.
Thanks, Raquel. I'm so glad that this discussion has also brought up socioeconomic status because one of the findings from the RBA, that's the Reserve Bank of Australia, I'm sure they'll forgive you. So they also have detected a decline in school students from low socioeconomic backgrounds studying economics. So that's also very concerning. That also speaks to this thread of elitism because it can be mapped to the public versus private school divide in Australia and the fact that fewer public schools are offering economics as that feeder into the university system. So that's something that does need attention. You're right about expanding our analysis to take into account relativities and comparisons with other fields. The question about commerce, yes, I think economics also there's been a bit of an identity crisis within how to label economics, and in some sectors, economics has kind of been absorbed into something called commerce or business, and it's lost its distinctiveness and its humanities elements, which is part of WEN's mission to really emphasize that distinction from finance, from accounting, from business. And lastly, the metrics that we use to measure impact. I'm glad you remarked on that because at the moment, really, we're using existing metrics such as keynote presentations, prizes. That's the existing system. But part of change and progress is also about challenging that existing system and drawing upon, for instance, the importance of service, the importance of really making a difference to the profession, and how can we work out a way for that to be elevated and valued as a measure of impact as well.
Thank you for those remarks, Lenora. Renee.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Raquel. Just one point about the gendered citations. So I think actually, if our results are driven by gendered citations, it would make the same point if they were not driven by gendered citations. And so, because our point is basically that you can't argue that women's ability or women's preferences drive everything if there's variation across countries. In the representation of women, that's correlated with country-specific factors, right? So if the citation patterns are correlated with country-specific factors, it also suggests that it's not women's preferences driving the results, right? So obviously it would be cool if we could show like who's citing whom, and see if that's, you know, if there's clustering of citations within a country. I'm not sure we can do that, but I don't think it's a problem for the interpretation. But thanks for raising that, because obviously, you know, gendered citations is a huge issue.
Okay, wonderful. I think we have 6 minutes or 5 minutes. And so if there's any questions from the floor, this would be an excellent moment to raise your hand and ask a brief, concise question. So I thought Sarah had put up her hand, but okay. So Neil Erickson, I think I have to like get your hand or something. Yes, and now I unmute you. Okay, so Neil, I think you need to unmute yourself. Wonderful, we can see you. Neil?
Yes. Can you hear me though?
Can you speak louder or put up your volume?
Yes. So can you hear me better there?
Yes.
So first, as a member of the program committee for this conference, I'd very much like to thank Raquel for such a detailed and cohesive discussion of these papers. Then a couple of very specific comments. I was really delighted to see sort of constructive work that Leonora had presented, because there's a lot of discussion on the evidence on gender and racial gaps in society. That's very key to document, but we also want to see what works. Very promising. On Anna's paper, I think it would really be interesting to go and examine the non-US born, not only for the reason that Raquel brought up, that it's such a large percentage, maybe US born PhD, but also that it's changed so dramatically over the last several decades. Go back 4 decades and it was very much smaller. So there's a time series aspect to that. And it's really important to understand this, because it has an influence on graduate schools' approach, PhD candidates, and also potential employer perspectives. And on that, I should note that historically, the Federal Reserve Board did very little hiring of US-born citizens as economists, and that changed about 2 decades ago, thanks to some very forward-looking policy by this chair at the time. So,
Thanks for those remarks, Neil. Any other questions from the floor? In that case, let me say thank you to all 5 of you. I really enjoyed this, and I'm sure the audience did too. And I'm sure everybody who's going to live stream it is also going to get a lot out of it. I think there's 2 minutes left before the governor comes on, and so maybe we can disappear from the screen. This is a comment, I guess, to Tim. Bye, everyone.
Great conversation. I'll go ahead and take you off the stage now.
So on behalf of the Organizing Committee, it is my great pleasure to welcome the Governor of the Bank of Canada, Steve Macklem, to give the closing remarks of the conference. Governor, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Cesar, and good evening to all our participants and anybody who's been watching. It is a great honor to wrap up what has been a very insightful day and bring this valuable conference to a close. I'm grateful that what began in 2018 between 3 central banks has grown to include the Bank of Canada, and I am really looking forward to hosting the conference next year in Ottawa. The issue of diversity and inclusion is very close to my heart. And when a central bank governor says something's close to their heart, what do? They give a speech about it. In April, I gave a speech that outlined how diversity and inclusion in our profession and our institution matters. And I went further to argue the case for an inclusive recovery to the pandemic. My colleagues at other central banks have given similar speeches. Indeed, this morning, Chair Powell kicked off the conference by observing that entrenched inequalities that prevent some of our citizens from fully participating in labor markets not only hold them back from opportunities, but they hold the whole economy back from realizing its full potential. This conversation at central banks has sparked a debate about whether central banks are expanding their mandates, whether we're overreaching, getting distracted from our focus on inflation targeting, and even a criticism that we should stay in our lane. My own view is that we are tasked with serving our citizens, not some of our citizens. Now, I probably don't have to convince anyone here that diversity and inclusion matters at every level of economics, finance, and central banking. It helps to avoid groupthink, it improves decision-making, and it fosters innovation. The research presented today by Professor Sarah Smith reinforces this conclusion by measuring gender differences in the way economic opinions are expressed. And as Professor Michael Weber's research underlines, our institutions generate more trust when our citizens see themselves reflected in us. We also heard today that we need to go beyond understanding diversity and inclusion in economics and finance to understanding how the work we do as economists and central bankers affects inequality. And drawing on some of the insights from today, that's what I'd like to discuss before we wrap up. Improving diversity at central banks and the economics profession is important. And we are making progress, even though there is some way to go. And Nobel laureate Esther Duflo's keynote speech vividly illustrated this, highlighting that we need to innovate at every level to accelerate progress. We also need to work on being inclusive, and that can be harder to measure. As we become more diverse, we need to make sure the people we add to the discussion feel wholly included and valued once they're at the table. Research we saw today provided some innovative examples on how to measure inclusiveness. And importantly, we need to bring an inclusive lens to the broader economy so that the benefits of increased prosperity are shared. So how do we get there? I won't pretend this is a comprehensive list, but I would highlight 3 dimensions. We need to be better listeners. We need to be more inclusive and more relatable communicators. And we need to better understand how our policy tools affect equality in the economy. So let me take each of these in turn. As central bank leaders, we can get so focused on where we are going that we can forget to stop and listen as often as we should. And we need to listen more to people who haven't been part of the discussion all along. At the Bank of Canada, we work hard to keep the diverse employees we've attracted by ensuring that they feel heard and included. We have several employee resource groups made up of people from equity-seeking groups and their allies. They're making important recommendations to help build a truly inclusive culture. We've also stepped up efforts to understand diverse perspectives by engaging in a wide variety of groups outside the bank. Our colleagues at the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank conducted mandate reviews that included outreach and consultation, and we've learned from that. For our review of our monetary policy framework, we met with a dozen civil society groups. We surveyed more than 8,500 Canadians, and we engaged over 200 people in online community discussions to gain insights into what they understood and thought about inflation targeting and the alternatives. All of this input is being considered as part of our upcoming renewal. In short, we listened. We've also added voices to our table. Recently, we helped found the Central Bank Network for Indigenous Inclusion, partnering with the Tulo Centre for Indigenous Economics here in Canada and with the central banks of New Zealand and Australia. And we're very pleased the Federal Reserve Banks of Minneapolis and St. Louis have also joined the network. This group is going to help us gain a better understanding of the economic realities of Indigenous peoples. Effective evidence-based policy decisions require insights deepened by understanding. Our commitment is to listen to Canadians' diverse perceptions and concerns. We do that by engaging directly with a broader set of stakeholders and integrating a wide array of perspectives from research, analysis, and other sources into our work. That's how we're going to learn. Communication comes next, and yes, it's close to my heart, so I used my second public speech as governor to talk about it at Jackson Hole. The last 15 years have seen a profound change in how information is shared, consumed, and debated, and central banks need to adapt. The internet has slashed the cost of communication. This has disrupted traditional media and led a growing segment of the public to get their news from alternative channels and social media. But the democratization of information hasn't necessarily made us better informed. With more information has come more disinformation. On top of that, the pandemic and our exceptional bond buying programs have challenged public perceptions of our operational independence. So it's more important, but harder, for central banks to be trusted sources of information and analysis. We build trust by clearly explaining our objectives and actions. Traditionally, we've spoken to people through markets, the media, and experts. We talk to them, and they explain our actions to people. But in this new world of ubiquitous information, we need to develop a direct channel to speak to people. That means being more accessible and more relatable. It means having new communication products and vehicles. Most central banks have started on this journey, and it's no easy task. At the Bank of Canada, we are expanding the scope and reach of our educational programming of the economy and the role of the Bank of Canada. And we want to increase our accountability and relevance through clear, relatable communications. Trust comes when everyone understands the actions we are taking and why. Research today presented by Professor Michael Weber reminded us that part of being relatable is having monetary policy committees that are representative of the diversity of the citizens we serve. And Professor Paula Profeta finds that the best indicator of improved gender equality on a central bank's monetary policy committee is improved gender equality among central bank staff. This underlines the importance of our efforts to attract and develop a more diverse workforce. Factoring inclusion and equality into our policy decisions is where we really walk the talk. Monetary policy is not the primary policy instrument to address inequality, but our policy formulation benefits from more diverse inputs, and our policies can affect inequality. Let me offer some live examples. First, when we set out at the Bank of Canada to review our inflation targeting framework with the federal government, we invited all Canadians to participate in the renewal process, and we published a report on what we heard. One message that came through clearly from Canadians is that they want our policies to be fair for everyone. Our focus on inflation control has long recognized that inflation is particularly tough for Canadians on low or fixed incomes because they are most affected when the purchasing power of cash declines. Low-income workers are also the most vulnerable to the boom and bust inflationary cycles. But is there more monetary policy can do to bring about a more inclusive economy? Very unequal impacts of the pandemic and the exceptional monetary policy tools we have deployed are challenging us to think more deeply about this question. In responding to the pandemic, we paid close attention to its very unequal impacts across sectors and across workers. We're also looking at how the monetary policy tools we've deployed, including quantitative easing, are affecting inequality. As the policy panel we had today made very clear, other central banks are also focused on understanding the distributional impacts of monetary policy. Changes in monetary policy have always had consequences for both income and wealth, on how both income and wealth are distributed. Similar to reducing interest rates, QE works to stimulate demand by lowering borrowing costs and encouraging spending. This supports job creation, and it's clear that the single best contributor to reducing income inequality is to get people into jobs. At the same time, our policy interest rate and QE also affect the prices of assets and not just the prices of government bonds. QE can boost wealth by increasing the value of assets, such as the investments Canadians have in their retirement savings plans and company pension plans. But of course, these assets aren't distributed entirely evenly across society. As a result, QE can widen wealth inequality. We will look closely at the outcomes of QE here and elsewhere, and we'll work to more fully understand its impact on both income and wealth inequality. Let me conclude. The conference today has sparked important research on diversity and inclusion at central banks and within the economics profession. It's my hope that this will help drive change at our own institutions and around the tables where decisions are taken. And I hope those decisions can ensure the economic recovery from the pandemic is as inclusive as possible. Thank you, everyone who made today's conference possible, despite the challenges of time zones and geographic reach. I look forward to seeing many of you next year, and I really hope we can be together in person in Ottawa. We need to continue this valuable work. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Macklem. This concludes our third conference on diversity and inclusion in economics, finance, and central banking. Thank you to all the presenters, the discussants, the panelists, the participants, the session chairs, our technical staff who've dealt with all sorts of challenges. We appreciate you. And of course, those of you who are watching online. It's been an incredible day with a lot of, I thought, very productive conversations, and I too look forward to seeing everyone in Ottawa to continue that conversations. Thank you very much, and take care.